Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio, and this is an expanded version of City Talk. A week after the 2004 election that gave George Bush majorities of both the popular and the electoral vote, when Republicans increased their majorities in the Senate and the House, and when the Supreme Court will be made over for a generation, the question is the one put to Alfie 40 years ago and repeated today. What's it all about? To help us understand what it's all about are my CUNY TV public affairs colleagues. Roscoe Brown, former president of CUNY's Bronx Community College and currently the head of the Center for Urban Education Policy at the CUNY Graduate Center. Ronnie Eldridge, former New York City council person, council member, and current host of CUNY TV's program Eldridge and Company. And Sarah Bartlett, reporter at Fortune, Businessweek, New York Times, and currently Bloomberg Professor of Journalism at my home college, Baruch College. Welcome to all of you, my fellow hosts. Tuesday night, Wednesday morning, when it became clear that Bush had been re-elected president of the United States, first reactions. Roscoe.
I've been down this road before.
Explain.
And my motto around these things is don't get mad, get even. We've got a lot of work to do because there are a lot of things that could turn back the clock. And it's our job to make sure the clock doesn't turn back.
Okay. Ronnie.
My reaction or turn back the clock? My reaction, I was shocked, I guess, and greatly disappointed, although not really surprised. So I don't know how you can be shocked and not surprised at the same time. And when you talk about turning back the clock, I'm worried about how all of this is going to be interpreted and what's going to happen in the future, because I think we have a lot of work to do.
And that's what we'll talk about. Sarah, from a professional's point of view, looking at this election, what was your professional reaction to all of this?
You know, I really never thought Kerry was going to win until the very bitter end, when some of the polls started to seem to change right that last day. And so I was surprised. I actually waited up pretty late. I was up till about 3:15 that night thinking, you know, let's see how it all plays out in Ohio and how does this provisional vote go. But, you know, I think that if you looked at all the polls right up until the end, it was pretty clear that Bush was going to win.
I thought the Democrats were going to win. I mean, I just didn't think there was a question about it. And so I wonder, could they have won with someone else? And how much of it really was the candidate's fault? I was not a supporter of John Kerry until he got the nomination. I'm so opposed to the Bush administration that I would have been for any Democrat as wholeheartedly as I could be.
My candidate was ABB, anybody but Bush.
Well,
but
that was...
Given that we have had Kerry, then the question is, what do we do? And I was always looking for an October surprise. And we got it. Brother bin Laden came out of the hills and scared the blank out of a lot of people. And I think that terror piece, together with the values piece, pushed us over the edge.
But, you know, there were some results of exit polls or interpretations, not that I think that they're the law or that we should listen to them too much, that people who were afraid of terrorism, a lot of them voted for Kerry. I mean, it was a funny kind of a twist in it.
I didn't think that the bin Laden tape had that big an impact.
I don't think John Kerry people ever warmed up to him. Yeah. I know I tried, and I've known him for a long time. And I tried. I really tried to.
Okay, let's try to put some structure on this. Was it the message or was it the messenger? Was it John Kerry, or in some sense, is it the Democratic Party? I mean, a larger question here is the relevance of the Democratic Party. When Roscoe says, don't get mad, get even, what does it mean to get even as a Democrat, Roscoe? What does it mean?
What it means is to identify the values that we have and promote those values and don't try to weasel back and forth. Clearly, the economy was terrible, the tax cut was terrible, health care was terrible, And Kerry and the Democratic Party did not emphasize that. In addition to which, we did a lot of speaking to the choir. We went to the major metropolitan areas, which we were going to win anyway. We didn't go to the heartland because we didn't want to hear what the heartland had to say. And that was a strategic mistake, and the people in the party are now beginning to admit that. Some states they didn't even go to.
So you're saying that this is both a strategic problem as well as something deeper, something about the Democratic Party.
Something about the American people.
Or the American people as well. We'll talk about
59 million people voted that way.
And then I guess one of the papers in England said, how could 59 million people be so dumb? I mean, clearly there is that view from the other side. Sarah?
I think it's hard to, I think Democrats have to be very careful to say that, you know, we didn't go to the heartland or we made strategic errors. I think we have to, you know, face up to the fact that George Bush resonated with a big chunk of the American population. He seemed to represent, even though in many ways he's Mr. Big Business and has ties to all sorts of major corporations, many people thought he was a man of the people. And that Kerry was a patrician.
Yeah, right.
And I think that they looked at him and said, well, he's a good old guy. He's somebody I can relate to. Kerry, all these townhouses, he's French, you know, I can't relate. And I think there's a real cultural gap that the Democrats have to.
Yeah, go ahead, Ronnie.
I agree with you. I think that that Kerry is too cosmopolitan, too sophisticated, and wasn't American enough. And George Bush personifies what being an American is. But that doesn't mean, I think, that his policies are necessarily the popular ones, because I still don't believe that they are. If you had a person who was equally as attractive personally, I still think the Democrats would have won. I think that we are that we're being thrown into an unanswerable thing when they say there wasn't a clear message. I think, Roscoe, there was a very clear message. I mean, it was like you, anybody but Bush, but it was also, he talked about the economy. I think that John Kerry did talk about the economy. He talked about the tax structure, on and on and on. He talked about the war in Iraq. It wasn't a clear position. He finally got to a position, but he never was clear about it.
Let me give
so
you...
that I don't like it when the Democrats, when now the pundits and the press and everybody else is saying, well, the Democrats have to find their message. They didn't have a message. I think they had a message.
Well,
I really
just
do.
wasn't as popular.
Or it wasn't as accepted.
Was it clearly delivered?
Okay.
I developed my top 5 reasons, you know, building on David Letterman.
Go ahead.
The first,
is this 5 or 1?
Was fear of terrorism.
Okay, is that that's number 1?
Number 2 was because of the get out the vote efforts, we brought out more conservative Republicans than we brought out young people. The data indicate we didn't bring out any more young people percentage-wise, but it brought a lot more conservative Republicans who were registered and then were registered again. For example, in Florida, they out-registered the Democrats by about 500,000.
And also, I mean, just to expand on your point, too, is that Roe, from the very beginning, said that the key to the election was driving out the evangelical base.
That's right.
And he apparently was very, very successful in doing that.
Well, they did that by putting all of these anti-gay marriage things on different state referenda.
Well,
I mean, that couldn't have been a cleverer technique to bring out the vote.
But I think how many volunteers they had in Florida? 10,000.
10,000 what?
Volunteers, conservatives, to bring out. The Democrats only had 3,000. And they brought out more conservative people.
But we're talking about if we had like an old-fashioned charismatic candidate. That used to be the candidate brought out people and voters.
And you know, if you
Where
talk
was
to
that
the
when
unions,
Roosevelt was elected?
Yeah, no, wait a minute.
If you talk to the unions, and you know, they had thousands of people. I feel pretty good about the Democrat running. The Democratic campaign was well run. They had orchestrated huge moves around Ohio, Pennsylvania. He wouldn't have won Pennsylvania had they not done that. So I think the Democrats did a decent job.
I think both sides activated their base, but I think that I tend to agree with Roscoe that ultimately the Republican strategy was more effective. But I certainly agree with Sarah that groups like Move On, Well, we'll see about that. And the unions were effective, but I think on the ground, it's much more effective to mobilize your base through the church, where you're dealing with matters of God than matters of self-interest.
Well, with people you know also. I mean, if you mobilize through the church, you know those people.
This is the community.
It was wonderful that people from New York wanted to go to Pennsylvania and Ohio and go all around the country, but they were, they didn't know them.
Strangers in
On
a
the other
strange
hand,
land.
it's important because we now have this we're being presented with the fact that we have a polarized country, which I'm not sure we have.
Well, we're going to get
to
that.
We need that cross-pollinization.
But we have to get back to Roscoe. Okay, number 3, Roscoe.
Number 3 was the candidate himself. The candidate did not inspire trust. The exit polls indicated that the population trusted Bush much more than Kerry. And part of that was the way he handled the Vietnam ads, the swift boat ads,
right,
which he really should have attacked right off.
Right.
And he equivocated on that.
He wasted a month of August.
And then being out windsurfing rather than
Snoopy
down
in the
NASCAR.
tank, right.
Now, these don't really seem much, but when you go to the polls, the exit polls, and you find out how people felt about him, they really believed in it. More people believed in his policies than believed in him.
Well, you said that you were ABB, anybody but
Yeah.
Bush, and in fact, I mean, not giving away my vote, I was not terribly impressed with Kerry until that first debate. Really, first of all, he never defined himself, whether positively or negatively, but when he was under attack, they stood there and took it like rope-a-dope.
But I think that you have to accept that, Kerry, everyone agrees, did better in all 3 debates.
Right.
You've got a war that is completely a flop. You've got an economy that is very damaged, and yet Bush won. And I think we have to accept that he appealed to the masses more than John Kerry. Even if they didn't feel that, his policies were working that well, they still voted for him.
Okay.
And the Democrats have to face up to that.
And I think it's more than simply Kerry. I think it's the narrative. I think Carville made the point that the Democrats lack the compelling story, and the Republicans have the story of ownership, of leadership,
and God,
and God.
The moral values issue. When they did the exit polls, that was the #1 thing that influenced their vote, 22 to 20% over the war. And one of the pundits had pointed out that by asking the question moral values rather than specifying humanistic values or values related to sex or whatever, they use the collective term moral values. And a lot of people who may have actually been against Kerry, before Kerry, voted that way.
And that was Gary Langer of ABC News.
Don't you think that part of moral values to a large degree was same-sex marriage?
No.
Oh, I do.
I think you read into that term what you want, and I think that was a
Abortion,
poorly worded
abortion
question.
and same-sex marriage. But can I just? I think that Kerry's message on Iraq was he was never able to overcome the vote in support of that resolution. He never was able to do that, and that was a basic problem. I remember the day he voted for that. I sat down at the computer and I emailed him and said, "I was going to support you. I will never support you." I mean, he never could explain it, and that was the thing that they picked up on, the waffling, the flip-flop, everything else, every time he tried to do it. And I think that was a great mistake. Now, well, are we going to talk about what's going to happen?
Yeah, well, we're going to look forward. I'd like Sarah to talk about to lead this off, the economy. What is it?
That's my number 4.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, you haven't finished
Do
his
number
list.
4. Do your list.
We never got the message across that Bush was responsible for the decline in the economy.
Okay, now do 5, and then I want to get to 4 with Sarah.
Let her
What's
finish
your
the
last
list.
one?
And 5 is we didn't reach the heartland states. We didn't put much effort into that mass of America, the Arkansas and the Missouris. We didn't put much effort there, and I think that was a mistake.
Okay. Sarah, economics. Looking forward for 4 years, what are the dominant issues, and what are going to be the conflicts over the next 4 years?
Well, I think that they're going to be huge, and I think, Bush has a real problem on his hands because the budget deficit, as you all know, is huge. The current account deficit, the deficit of our nation with the rest of the world in terms of trading goods and services, is also huge. It's almost 6% of our total economic output. And these are unsustainable numbers. So we're really at the hands, we're totally reliant at this point on foreigners liking our currency, wanting to hold lots of dollars in their bank accounts, and wanting to invest in our country. And I don't think that foreigners are going to necessarily feel that good about us for a long time.
Okay, they'd start feeling lousy about us. What happens? How does that affect us?
We had pretty good evidence that foreigners didn't like Bush to begin with, right?
Yeah.
They were opposed to his reelection.
But that doesn't prevent them
I
from
think
making
the
money.
issue
No, I'm
is,
just- well-
are we going to have some kind of financial crisis over the next 4 years? I mean, oddly enough, the Republicans are, at this point, tarred with the idea that they are growing a huge budget deficit. That's usually been a criticism aimed at Democrats.
But see,
we're running a very profligate, economy, and he's going to have to face up to that. And his whole strategy for economic growth is cut taxes, loosen regulation on business, and let the entrepreneurial spirit blossom in this country.
And that's going to make up $7 trillion?
That's the big question.
But this is where the wedge comes in. The Republicans themselves are split, the social conservatives and the fiscal conservatives. And if the Democrats are smart, they'll take issue by issue and mobilize their coalitions. They did that in one of the Clinton tax reform bills. They got the conservatives to come along with the liberals. They passed some things that they wanted, got some things that we wanted. This is a challenge. It's clear. And believe me, when somebody's paycheck starts getting smaller, or they stop getting any, this business about I don't like gays or I want gun control will go out of the way, because what are you going to do for me today is the question.
But wait a minute, but wasn't that the situation in Ohio when they still voted for Bush? I mean, is there some element here that people didn't necessarily vote their pocketbook but voted on other matters?
I think that the economy didn't play a big role in this election. Whether it should have or not is another issue.
Now, was that
but I
the
don't
fault
think
of the candidate, Kerry, or?
I think Kerry talked about it a lot, and
Yeah.
I think that the media talked about it a lot.
So voters,
I just
that was a
think
secondary
it was
concern. It
unfair.
wasn't the economy, Stu.
But that
I
was
don't think
Bush's
so.
strategy. 25% of the electorate in Ohio were conservative Republicans who were concerned about these moral values, and the Republicans just brought them out, a larger proportion of the electorate than in the previous year. So therefore, the unions were fighting against the conservatives, and the conservatives won in this instance.
Right,
Sarah-
and the 527s like move on too. Go ahead.
When they talk about the economy, the president's already said that he wants to do tax restructuring, talking about a single tax or a sales tax,
Flat
national
tax,
sales tax,
right.
and Social Security. So
Yeah,
do
I
you
wanna-
think he's going to be able to move with any of those things?
Well, I think it's going to be fascinating in the next 4 years, because he is saying that he is going to tackle the two sort of third rail issues in politics. I mean, to say that you're going to basically take on some of these radical ideas for tax reform is going to have huge political ramifications. Let's just talk about the two ideas that he specifically has thrown out as being under consideration. One is a national sales tax, and the other is a flat tax. Both, the concept behind all of these is we should not tax savings and investments. If you're generating income from your stocks or your bonds, we don't want to tax that. And shifting more of the burden onto wages and benefits.
Class war.
It's going to be class warfare, because right now the way that the sort of split divides the taxable income in this country, about 2/3 of that taxable income is from wages and benefits, and about 1/3 is from capital. So they're going to shift it. They want to basically preserve capital as a tax-free area to generate income and shift it all onto wages and benefits. Well, guess who that's going to fit? Now they're saying, oh, don't worry, we'll take care of the lower income families. We'll put a ceiling so that they won't pay any tax at all. But the burden, by definition, has to fall on the middle class, unless they cut spending so much. And at
which
this
also
point,
will
with the
then-
war in Iraq, which we're not even seeing the real bills for yet, there's going to be, the only other place to cut is on domestic spending programs. And so I think that's going to generate an enormous, once the repercussions of that become clear, I think that's going to be a very hot
Well, let's
topic.
talk about Social Security, because some of us are approaching the age and some of us have already approached the age where they're receiving it. What is the story with Social Security? And how is he going to behave toward it, and what's the fight?
Well, his whole philosophy is to create more of an ownership society. That's a phrase that he bandies about, and what he's talking about is allowing, we now, 12.4% payroll tax is what we all see taken out of our paychecks. They're proposing to take some portion of that. They haven't said the exact number, but it's probably somewhere between 2 and 6 percentage points, and allow people who want to put it into an individual account. And their hope is that by having individuals investing, they'll be able to generate greater returns. Those people will have, more money in their retirement.
Wait a minute.
What happens if they don't?
Suppose if the stock market goes into the tank.
Well,
what happens?
Some of us had that experience in 2000.
Well, we recently had Paul Volcker attending a Q&A session at Baruch, and someone asked him this question, and he said, I may be very old-fashioned, but I think that if I have two neighbors, and the neighbor on one side has done a fabulous job and is, living it up in retirement because they were really smart investors, and my neighbor on the other side lost everything because they weren't so good at it, he said, I don't feel that that's a government safety net. And he said, I really am uncomfortable, and I think that's very
Are there
valid.
restrictions on when you can spend that money in the account?
They haven't gotten that specific yet. But there's one really key point for the economy, which is how do we get from here to there? Right now, if they allow people to divert this money into their private savings accounts, that's money that's going to be a shortfall to pay the people like you.
Excuse me, thank you.
And so that could be as much as $2 trillion over the next 10 years. If you figure, well, they're saying, how are we going to finance that? That adds to the budget deficit. We're going to have to borrow, the government would have to borrow more money in the debt markets to make up this shortfall, which they'll eventually get theoretically when these
this debt is being bought by these foreigners that you talked about
so
before.
It's going to put an additional burden on. Well, that's the issue. Is how can you? That's the big question. Is how do you go through this transitional period without causing the government to basically crowd out private sector investment?
Well, one thing we have to deal with, and the American public is not dealing with it, is the facts. For example, a third of the voters, particularly Republican, thought that they found weapons of mass destruction, despite the fact that every fact indicates it doesn't pay. Right now, the facts indicate that Social Security on its present stand, with the same contributions, is solvent until 2040 or 2043. Clearly, there's some maneuvering, possibly raising the age, possibly changing the... And those are incremental things. Unfortunately, some people believe that all of a sudden I'm going to invest like the lottery. I'm going to invest in the stocks. I'm going to get to be rich. And that's where the message of the Democrats is very important, and that's where bridging the gap with the fiscal conservatives from the Republicans. Those folks out there from Utah and all those places, they don't want to see their people broke. So therefore, there's a room here. It's both a challenge and an opportunity. Some people say it's a problem. Some people say it's an opportunity. I think it's an opportunity to help the American people begin to think for themselves and express that through their representatives, whether they're Republican or Democrat.
Yeah, it was interesting. Kerry always said that he was a fiscal conservative, that he was for a balanced budget, that he was certainly against, and it didn't seem to
resonate.
No, not at all. Not at all.
First of all, his votes didn't necessarily prove that.
Right.
That's one of the issues that you deal with.
One of my concerns with Social Security, irrespective of the amount of money you make from it, maybe it's because I'm a political scientist, is this notion of the intergenerational compact, that generations owe it to each other, and there's some kind of glue. And this is removing that glue. I mean, we know that capitalism is, brutally efficient, and it breaks down all this traditional ties, but aren't we violating?
Brutally efficient, make some people rich and some poor.
Right, right. I mean, that's the way the market works. Aren't we losing this another element of community here?
Yeah. Well, there was a fascinating description of a conversation that was supposedly took place between Pete Peterson, who's a very fiscally conservative gentleman, and President Bush. They were debating the issue of Social Security and the deficit and how you're going to deal with that. And he said, I'd like to put this in moral values, in moral terms. Is it moral to pass this huge debt onto our children and our grandchildren? You want to talk about moral values? What's moral about that?
Well, that would be part of the reframing that we were talking about in terms of the narrative, to regain the high ground, if you will, by redefining some of these issues about what does it mean to be moral? What does it mean to have family values?
Yeah, the first step to be moral is to get out of Iraq.
Okay, and in terms of that war.
Both economically and politically. Hopefully they'll be able to pacify and maybe divide the country. But clearly that Iraq thing will hold us for 20 years, and we cannot afford it. And somebody has to say it, and I believe it's a Republican. I think McCain would say it. I think that there is some
He's not
synergy.
saying it,
He hasn't
You're
said
just
it yet.
looking to Nixon
Say
and
what,
China,
though?
aren't you?
Say
right.
what?
There
Yes,
you
you are. That, we've
Well, wait a
come-
minute, wait. Well, say what? What do you want him to say?
Say that we need to get out of Iraq immediately, turn the resources over to them, let them solve their own problem because they have a tripartite
we've created
country.
the problem.
But,
We've made it
no,
much
the problem was created in the Ottoman Empire when we gave the
wait a minute. Let's deal with more current
the point
events.
is that we helped to create that. We funded Saddam because he wanted to keep the Russians away. We need to back out of it, and that's what I think Kerry was attempting to do. And the United Nations would be the mechanism through which we do that.
And they belittled it.
And
Wait a
didn't
minute.
they?
Believe
Wait a
me,
minute.
I
I don't
want-
buy this.
I wanted to talk about Social Security. I wasn't ready to move on.
Okay.
I was just thinking, Social
then
Security is
we'll
almost
go
as
back
old
to
as
you.
I am, because I was born 1931 when Franklin Roosevelt became president. And there was a reason that Social Security program was presented to the American public or to the Congress. And you were right, we've come there's such a distance now, people don't understand what is Social Security all about. And it does need to be
most people don't know what
changed
the
and adjusted,
Vietnam War
doesn't it?
was.
Because
Right. Well, about students.
Well,
we
see,
are
life-
living longer and longer.
life
We
expectancy.
are changing, but it's become one of those things that it's a symbol. Don't change it. Don't move it.
I think
Roscoe made the point that it's incremental, and we have to begin to discuss it in a different way that people will understand what we're talking
life
about.
expectancy when Roosevelt
Yeah,
passed
right.
Social Security was about 65.
Exactly, that's
And
why
that
it was
means if you
retirement.
made it to 65,
Yeah.
you get some
No,
life
I think
expectancy now is about 78 or something like
Better
that.
be more.
Democrats and Republicans, I think, all agree that there has to be some changes
But do
in
people
Social
understand
Security.
it? I don't think they do.
I don't think they
people
do. I think
understand what
everyone's
it's all
hoping
about.
there's a silver bullet, and there really isn't.
And they haven't found. Obviously, there isn't
It's an
one.
intractable-
The vampire is out there.
And every
wants
day
to
that we
suck your
don't
blood.
try to address it, it
Yeah.
just gets
Well,
worse.
the simplest thing, given the extended life expectancy, 78, 79, clearly Social Security could be phased in, increasing the age to 67, to 68, to 69, to 70. Clearly that could be done. I think many people would identify with that. Also, there's some modification in terms of what's the base salary on which Social Security. Those are things that the Social Security Committee actually presented. So these issues are out there. There's plenty to work on, and I think that the fiscal conservatives will work with the Democrats on the Republican side to see that this is done without throwing us over to the stock
But
market.
I don't think that's what the Bush administration is trying to accomplish
Exactly.
with
No,
these
that's not what
reforms.
they're trying to
They're
accomplish.
really not trying to fix the Social Security problem. They're trying to inculcate this, great sense of an ownership society. It's an ideological move to spread the sort of fervor of capitalism into every corner
I
of
think
this,
everything they do is an ideological move.
Well, okay, so we've talked about
And that's-
the
right.
culture war a little bit.
Right.
We talked about the class war a little bit. Let's go back to the military war in Iraq, and then I want to touch on the religious war and some other wars that are going on. Okay. Roscoe, I don't buy it. I don't think that we withdraw. I don't think McCain says it. I think to a certain extent you almost have to be kicked out rather than leave. I don't see an exit strategy. I can see exit outcomes, but I don't see an exit strategy in all of this.
Well, in Vietnam, when they got 65,000 body bags, the country said, let's get the hell out of there. I'm not predicting it. I hope it won't happen.
Right.
But the fact is that the casualties are going to increase, the economic effect is going to increase, and the religious fervor is going to still be there.
So you declare victory and
we need
leave.
to work with the United Nations to gradually get ourselves out of there and leave it to the Iraqis, because they may well, they got 25 million people. They may well petition themselves. Remember, Iran has 59 million people. That's a larger problem. So I'm sure that there are people in the foreign affairs community, probably Colin Powell among them, understands that this is a strategy. The short-term strategy, they got rid of Hussein, but they couldn't find the weapons. They gave them away to all the people. And now we've got to figure out some way of getting out. And that should be the message. And possibly, if Kerry had delivered that message clearly, he might have gotten people.
I don't agree.
Okay,
I really think that a lot of Americans feel that now, that having gone there and having caused as much damage as we've caused, and essentially started this incredible war
and staked our credibility
that,
in a sense.
That we have a moral obligation to return it to some
Roscoe
sense
is saying
of
that
stability.
we can do it, provide the moral obligation through different channels instead of war.
Well, that
remains
it's hardly
to be seen. Moral obligation to go in and kill more.
Remember,
but wait.
I'm saying that I think that Americans feel that we have an obligation to stabilize the country, that having gone in and caused such a ruckus.
How are you going to stabilize it when it hasn't been stabilized in 100 years?
Yeah,
the
the only way
there's
to
a difference
stabilize it.
between
There's
the
no
reality and the
electricity, there's no
perception.
water.
Saddam
out
Hussein
there.
stabilized it with fear and terror.
Not only that, he
But-
stabilized it with a great infrastructure and so on.
But what I have never understood is why there wasn't a more of a connection between Iraq as a breeding ground for terrorism. That's what I think it is. It's just the longer we go on, the worse it gets, the more we're instilling that fervor in other parts of the world.
The biggest breeding ground for terrorism is our friend Saudi Arabia.
Right.
But Laden didn't come from Iraq.
Wait a minute, I
No,
see
but I mean the fact that we're in Iraq fighting.
I understand.
You know.
I see two poles of conversation here, if I may. I see sort of the Roscoe Ronnie pole and a Sarah Doug pole here, and that is that what you guys seem to be saying is that the situation's objectively bad, and we need to do something on this objective badness. And I think what Sarah and I are saying that is that it may be objectively bad, but that doesn't matter. It is a perception
I don't think
on
that-
the part of the American people, both of the facts on the ground, which Roscoe referred to before. They're wrong. They don't have the facts. They don't know that there are no weapons of mass destruction. They don't know that there was no Al-Qaeda connection. But they're dealing with, if I sound like a real professor,
You
a
do.
meta-narrative
They're going
over
on
here.
and on and on.
No, yeah, but the point is that, that you keep insisting that
I don't
there's a
think we're-
real
I wanna say-
world, and these people are going to come to some kind of an enlightenment,
I
or
think
they're
that,
stupid.
I don't even think we're that far apart. I think that we all agree that we can't just walk out of there and not put the UN in there or other forces that are going to answer the humanitarian needs. I don't
Including
think
some of
any
the
of us are
Muslim
denying that.
communities.
Now, what you're doing is what they're trying to do to us and say there's the red states and the blue states, and we're so polarized. We're not polarized. Let's find the common ground and figure out
I think
a good
you're
system.
absolutely wrong. I think there is polarization,
Doug,
and it's deep.
In
Doug,
this
if
four?
staying in there...
No,
The
not
four-
among
I'm talking
us.
about the four
Oh,
of
I'm
us.
talking about the country.
Doug, if staying in there reduced your spendable income by 33%, how would you feel about it?
Me personally, and
Yeah,
rationally evaluate that and be aware of it.
Yeah,
Of course, how I would vote, but that doesn't mean.
Remember, there's some history here. When the Americans began to spend so much money to do Iraq and the people were getting killed, people said,
Vietnam.
people say, get the hell out of there. And I maintain that on the short term, we're proud, we're taking Fallujah, we're doing this, but on a 10-year period, and it finds that 33% of the gross national product is going to protecting Iraq, believe me, we'll be out of there in a half a second.
I don't even think people are that proud that they're taking Fallujah. I think everybody's scared.
Yeah, well.
I mean, the part of the country that you say that we're separated from is the part of the country that's supplying a lot of the soldiers.
Yeah.
If you read the casualties, that's where they're coming from. They don't want their sons, husbands, fathers.
Because it's a poor man's draft. The National Guard
that's right.
is poor people.
And
It's
then
not,
we have to
But wait a
expand.
minute,
Not the
but
Wall
wait a minute.
Street
But these
birds.
people, excuse me, these people, when you look at the map, they voted for Bush. They voted for Bush. Wait a second. They voted for Bush for a reason. They're not irrational.
What's the reason?
Well, I think it is they voted on their feelings and their beliefs rather than Bush's performance.
and the knowledge that the
They
third
voted
of
the
them
way
thought
Sarah
that there were
said.
still weapons of mass destruction
Well,
there.
clearly, I mean, the survey suggests that the particularly University of Maryland survey before the election suggested that Bush voters were far more unaware / ignorant of the facts as well as their own candidate's position than Kerry. So there's some element to that. But it sounds like liberal whining, elitist whining that we're smarter than they are and they're just stupid.
Well, let's talk about the
come
media.
on.
Let's talk about our enterprise in media. If you fed night after night on Fox News and MSNBC how well things are going, most
And the
people don't
radio.
read the New York Times
And the
or
radio.
the Nation. Or
Right.
and so therefore, there is a function for those of us in education. How do we help our students to become self-critical, to be critical of information, to ask questions, and not to be a bad guy because you ask a question. Because what happens on these conservative shows, you ask an intelligent question, they put you down in a minute. So we have some things to do, whether we're Democrats or Republicans, to raise the level of the dialogue, because it is the blue states versus the red states, the liberals. But as Ronnie and I were talking before the show, there are many, many things that most people agree on, whether it's in Weight Watchers or whether it's in the running community, or whether it's in the arts community. So we need to change the dialogue. And I would hope, as folks watch our show, we see we're trying to change the dialogue, respectful of people's opinion, analyzing people's opinion, and trying to reach toward a middle ground, because that's really the kind of thing we should be doing.
Do you want to comment on the media and the role of the media in this, and sort of your role now, your dual role as a member of the media, but also an academic who's trying to teach this critical thinking that Roscoe's talking about?
You know, you may think this is silly, but I teach journalism, and I felt very uncomfortable allowing the election to enter into my classroom very much, because I felt that I knew that I had some students who were very Republican, I had some students who were very Democrat, and I think one of the things that's been so sad about this is that there's become such a breach between the two that one side cannot fathom how the other can think, and vice versa. And there's a sort of, and I felt very uncomfortable indicating what my own political views were, because I didn't want to feel that some students would feel, well, now I can't say because I disagree with you and I'm going to get in trouble with the teacher. So I actually, until the election was over, I really didn't bring it into the classroom. And actually, the day after the election, the morning after, I had a class. I was a little bleary-eyed. And right in the middle of the class, Carrie conceded. So it was a sort of dramatic moment. But since then, we've been talking about the business issues, since it's business journalism. And I think to answer your broader question, I think the media didn't perform very well at all in this election. I think that there were a lot of pat stories that were written. There were a lot of missed opportunities to ask real questions. I thought the debates were better than I expected.
Yeah.
I'm so used to them being completely meaningless that I was stunned that there actually were conclusions able to be drawn.
This is a good example of people coming together. Two of the greatest Americans in terms of negotiation, Vernon Jordan and Jim Baker. Jim Baker, former Secretary of State, negotiated for the Republicans, and Vernon negotiated for the Democrats. And so they made a compromise so that we had a decent debate. I wasn't particularly happy about the timeline because Bush couldn't talk his 2 minutes and Kerry talked more than his 2 minutes. But other than that, the format was a challenging format, and I thought that Bob Schaefer did an excellent job in bringing out those points. This is what the journalism should be. But we now have to get to the conversation in the bars, in the living rooms. And part of this is catalyzed by the fact in sports talk shows now, there's so many extremes. You know, the Red Sox versus the Yankees and all that kind of. We have to begin to use our collective energy, our collective interpretation, because the sun's going to come up tomorrow morning for all of us. And we're going to have food, we're going to have housing. And all of us will have a relative who's sick, have someone who's gay, has someone who has a problem. And those are the kind of things. So what I have done is to say, where do we go in the future? See, I got my top five.
Man, you got a top. He's got a lot of top.
Can I, before you change it, I want to talk a little bit about the media, though, before you go on.
Go, and then you go, Roscoe. Go ahead.
All right. I think if you watch C-SPAN, it was the best coverage, because it wasn't filled with talking heads, with people who felt they had to have an opinion. I got so tired of listening. Like us, yeah. But we're only on for a half hour unless we have a giant show like this for an hour. But there was such a long coverage and so much talking. And seriously, some of the things they picked up and talked about were so ridiculous, and they made issues out of things that shouldn't have been issues. C-SPAN covered gavel to gavel. They watched the debates. You saw the people come in. You saw the stuff at the beginning of the debate, you know, how they instructed the audience and all of that. You watched the conventions, which have been so polluted and perverted by the parties. I think the parties have been, I think the politics is terrible. And I think that's responsible for a lot of what's happening.
Okay, we're going to get to that after we hear his list. Go ahead.
But we need to be more moderate about the coverage. I mean, we need to.
What do you mean more moderate?
Well, I mean,
Well,
I don't
let
think
me
they
pick
should
up on
do
that,
it so much,
because-
and I think
but you're not
the
gonna stop that,
advertising
Ronnie.
money that goes
Yeah.
into it is much too great, and there's too much of these stupid commercials.
Okay,
well,
my first
It's Federal Airways, and
my
we own
first-
those airways.
My
But I guess
first
that's now-
direction for the future is related to
Okay.
what you say. A clearer articulation of the issues.
Meaning?
And that means the media, that means the parties, indicating what the issues are, using the data, for example. And that's something that we must do on the Republican side, on the Democratic side.
Can I just
Second-
interject for a second? But is it a question of data? Is it
Yes,
a question
it
of
is.
world
It's
views
what
as much
I say,
as
I said
data?
articulation, presentation.
Okay,
Presentation.
Go.
That's very
I'm
important.
sorry I interrupted you. Liz.
Secondly, we need to stress that values is not a conservative idea. All of us have values, and all of us are on different sides of those values. And particularly for the Democrats, they never use the word values. Maybe they should use those and point out that making sure somebody has health care is a value. Making sure that a handicapped person is taken care of, that's a
Restructuring
value.
the message.
So then the third thing is that we must have candidates who identify with the constituency. Upper class Massachusetts candidates do not really resonate. The last time we had Democratic presidents, they were both from the South, great people, Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton. They could resonate, they could identify with the issues. One of the things that I know Clinton, and he told me that when he was a young boy in Arkansas, and he was trying to argue that integration was fine, etc., he used my group, the Tuskegee Airmen, the Black Pilots, as an example of excellence. And he said that won every argument. Well, Bill Clinton was very, very persuasive. I think there are a whole range of candidates who we don't even know now who need to be considered. It's not the old gang from the far west or the far east. And
including our junior senator?
including everybody.
Okay, including
And
everybody.
then the other point is that in the decision-making process in the Democratic Party, they need to be more inclusive of African Americans, more inclusive of Hispanics, because Hispanics are gravitating toward the Republicans
44%.
because they are including them. More inclusion of women in particular, more inclusion of the clerical population. We do not have an inclusiveness that we need to have in the Democratic Party.
But
Okay.
can I add?
Go,
can we
go,
touch-
of course.
I think we have to change the way we nominate candidates. I think to think and put all of that effort, first place, the length of time,
Yeah.
then Iowa and New Hampshire are the things to pick our candidates. It's totally ridiculous. Talk about, splitting, it's just crazy. But the other thing is to go back to the television business. I'm not wrong when we talk about the television advertising, because the people who are now much more in control are the people who have the money. The candidates spend more time raising money than they do meeting constituents. And of course, part of it is the security. You're not as happy to go into large places or walk down the street or have outdoor rallies. But there is much too much about that money. Public airways, they are public airways. We own those airways. It seems to me at some point, and we'll never be able to do it, I mean, it's all this kind of going round and round in a circle, because the people in Congress are never going to pass the legislation that's going to enable us to do that. But those are things we have to strive for. But I think paramount to this is how we nominate a candidate and who really calls the shots and directs it.
Well,
And
conventions are passé now.
They're-
Conventions used to be
Well,
the
the
place.
coronation.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
They used to be exciting and fun, and it was. I mean, I participated in those McGovern. We called them the McGovern Reforms. How we changed the system and took it out of boss rule, right? Because we didn't want Mayor Daley telling us who we were going to have. In fact, most of the time they worked better. They came out with more balanced tickets and everything else. But
Go ahead. I'm going to take
I don't know what the
contrarian
answer
view.
is, but I think we have to find some way to
Yeah,
change
no,
it.
I wax nostalgic, even though it's mainly from the history books, about the old style conventions. I found the conventions to be very instructive about the orientations of the
Which
party and
convention?
what they meant. Both of them.
Oh,
they
come
told you
on.
exactly what these parties were about and where they were headed and what their
Well,
stories
if that's
were.
the case, you could have rented a Broadway theater and have
Well,
people sitting
was
in there
theater.
with
Well,
signs.
but that's exactly right.
That's not the purpose of a convention.
Oh, wait, that's
I think
not
it
the
is.
purpose of the old conventions. Who says it's not the purpose of the new
Well,
convention?
remember, democracy is the people. I was a delegate to 2 conventions, both of them for Jesse Jackson. I was on the platform committee. I was actually instrumental in helping to change some aspects of the platform committee because they wanted our votes and we wanted their votes.
This is why I want to be Roscoe.
So therefore, you know, when you have a problem and you keep doing the same thing, the psychiatrists call you crazy.
But now,
so
what
therefore, we need to try to change.
So
some
how
of the
are we?
things
But
do.
what's going to happen? We're seeing how people are reading the results of this election.
Okay, good.
And they're saying we're so polarized, and it's the Eastern intellectual sophisticates who think they know so much and everything else, and we're wrong,
Hollywood.
and the liberals and everything
But
else.
who
We're
is
wrong.
saying that? Who is saying that? The same Eastern intellectuals.
press-
and
The press is saying
Look at the
it.
map. The map says
The
it.
Democrats, some of the Democrats, I don't know. Are they saying that?
But
Are
if
we
you begin-
bringing life into that Democratic? What's the group that Clinton came out of that I?
The
Democratic
Leadership Council.
Yeah.
Democratic
I
Leadership
think,
Council.
remember,
seems to me
when
they've
you,
always been pretty
when you
much in
lose, you
control.
got to defend why you lost.
Yeah.
The fact is there are a lot of folks like us who are talking about this new approach, dealing with the issues, involving more people, changing the leadership of the Democratic National Committee. You can't have a clique, whether it's Democratic or Republican, running the country for any great length of time. And we got 2 major issues. We got the war and we got the economy with the fallouts on Social Security and tax policy. We've got to articulate that. And I would hope that on your show, Doug, and your show, we continue to get people to think. Because the public is not stupid. The public does think. The problem is that their message is so narrowed by what is going across. We also have public financing of campaigns. So that would eliminate some of the necessity of raising money for advertising. We'll have free advertising. We can work toward that because that's what the country, you know, this country's gone through a lot of things. In the Civil War, only 48% of the people voted for Abraham Lincoln. And yet he was able to bring us through this. We had Grant, and we had Teapot Dome, and we had...
So we've gone through a lot, and we'll go through more.
Watergate.
Country. But the interesting thing, Richard Nixon, who many of us oppose, did 2 major things that helped this country. One, he established relationships with China, and second, he started affirmative action and opening up the civil rights dialogue. Those are 2 things that he did.
Okay.
Are you saying that you think that might happen in the Bush administration?
Yeah, that's
second
what I
Bush
was going to ask. Do you see
Well,
something
okay.
positive?
Well, first of all,
Glasnost?
Yes.
see, I do believe that people respond to the immediate feedback they're getting. Clearly, Bush is emboldened. He thinks he has a blank check. That ain't going to happen. Some of his people, like Chuck Hagel and them, on the Republican side are going to say, hey, look, slow down here. And then some people on the Democratic side are going to be saying, look, there are some places where we can relate. Like our inspector is going to slow down this constitutional amendment on gays. That's ridiculous. When it comes to selecting a Supreme Court justice to fill the next vacant, they might want a strict constructionist, but it can't be a strict constructionist who has an ideological bent one way or the other. And I think that there's a mass of what we have in this country. We have a lot of history. We have a lot of people, and we have a lot of interaction that will go on. And things like what we're doing here is, I must go to 5 living room discussions with people who are, many of them radical, some of them not so radical. And they're realizing that the message we are sending and the way we're communicating is not clear.
So you really don't accept then the idea that the Republican Party is in ascendance and is dominating every, the congressional, both sides of the House and the Senate, the executive branch, certainly is going to control the judiciary for some period of
And
time.
state houses,
And the state
governorships, and
houses.
increasingly state
I think there's a
legislature.
real argument that the Republican Party has captured the imagination of the American population in a way that the Democrats do not. And it's not just the messenger.
The percentage of variation is 3%. That's 3 out of 100. So that's the first thing we have. And there was some manipulation with the vote, and we didn't get the right folks out. Remember, the Democrats were split during Roosevelt. The Southern Democrats and the Northern Democrats, industrial Democrats, and they made themselves over. The Republicans, the party of Rockefeller, is different than the more recent parties of Giuliani and Bush. So I think that the needs and the inevitable problems we're going to come up with the finance and the concern about the poor. You can't have a country where 25% of the people are living in poverty.
Did you
and
hear?
democracy.
I'm glad you said that, because did you hear one candidate say one thing about poor people in this whole election?
Well, Kerry did try to address the health insurance issue.
Well, he only talked
is-
about the middle class. He just only talked about the middle class. The health issue was for the
Well,
middle
see,
class.
that's-
Everything was for the middle class. And every time he said that, I sort of sat up a little bit.
Well, that's redefining the message.
Well, do you think there'll be a war for the heart of the Democratic Party? I mean, there's now word that
it's
Dean
already
is going to
started.
run the,
Yeah.
Well, that's the
push
question.
it
I mean,
left, push it center.
right. I mean,
where
the
do you
question
go?
is whether the Democratic Party, and is it WH or WITHER? Where's it going? And is it? Sarah and I seem to be, again, if we can do these polarities here, much less sanguine. You seem more sanguine about the prospects of the Democratic Party, saying it's happened before. You could go back to the Republicans in '64.
I'm sanguine about the development of the country. And I think that some of these really extreme right-wing positions will not carry.
Why not? They have the political
Well,
power.
they
to push them through.
they have the
Agree with
political
you.
power, but some of them are antithetical to the people who are voting for them. When people begin to see their jobs go, when people begin to see body bags come back, they're not going to be standing up clapping. Remember, I was one of the protesters protesting the war in Vietnam. When I was at NYU in 1965, we did the first teach-in against the war in New York City. And people beating up us, we were unpatriotic. Come 1972, everybody said, how can I join this protest? So you have to have some historical perspective, and you have to talk about the issues the way they are. The Republicans are not all dragons, and the Democrats are not all angels. And that's why I think that the involvement of African Americans, Latinos, women, will help change the way we discuss this.
And our way of looking at this is being so polarized, because I don't think...
Okay, let's go back to polarized. I want to go back to polarized one more time. It seems to me that the parties in Congress are really polarized, that there are no moderates in the Senate, Republicans. There are about 5 or 6 of them. Wait a minute, all inspector is in danger. There's about 5 moderate Republicans in the Senate.
The one moderate Republican, the senator, is leading the whole thing on the security.
Yeah, it depends on the issue.
Wait a minute. But let's look at all inspector as an example. All inspector may not get the chair of the Judiciary Committee because he's too moderate. So you're telling me that it's not polarized. You have great faith in the country, and you just reject the polarization. What I see is red states, red states, red states. Excuse me, blue states, blue states, blue states.
But if you keep saying it, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
And
denying it doesn't change the reality.
These Republicans, they have different issues that they're concerned with. Some are more concerned with the environment, some are more concerned with the Social Security, some are more concerned with the taxes. And part of the genius of being in government is how to bring coalitions together, how to work through these things. See,
unless you're on top and you want to beat the guys on the bottom.
You're self-censoring yourself, and that's a very dangerous thing. And I think what
I'm not censoring myself.
You're not censoring yourself. You're censoring people who feel the way Roscoe and...
No, I'm just disagreeing with it.
You're saying that our inspector, is not going to become chair of the committee.
If he does not,
well, he
and
was
it's
silly.
possibly...
That was really not very politic of him to make such a statement at a time when he's waiting to get the chairmanship. It was just stupid. So I don't understand. But he's in line, and he should get it, and he most likely will get it. And I don't think everybody has to declare their intentions now so that they start a war. They don't have to.
For example,
what Roscoe's saying is do it gradually, do it sensibly, be political about it.
We were great Democrats, and some great Democrats didn't like the welfare reform.
Right.
And there's some aspects that weren't there, but the fact is, on balance, it was more positive than negative. So therefore, you have to have a dialogue, and part of the dialogue has to be informed with information. And part of that information has to come both from the media, from the educators, and from the political people themselves. I don't think that we should indulge in a self-fulfilling prophecy that this country is going to be so bad that all of us are going to have to move to Canada. I thought that was an emotional response on Wednesday morning because we thought we were going to win.
No, I don't feel that way. I don't I'm not saying that. I just think that there's a certain realism. I think people are trying to sort of say, well, maybe it was this, maybe it was that. We have to tinker here, we have to tinker there. I don't see tinkering as being the answer. I think that there was a very clear vote by a majority of Americans that they think a certain way, that they have a certain set of values, and that the Democrats are not resonating with those people.
Would you have said this in 2000 when we had the majority?
Well, but I think from a
Right?
Democrat...
I think it's very different.
Well, now let's
No,
talk-
I think it is. I think it's
All
crystallized.
right, but let's talk about from the Democratic point of view. They lost an election by 3 million votes, and how many electoral votes? I never remember. They have to reconstitute their party. And the question and the challenge is, how are they going to do it? So that's where Democrats should be focusing their attention right now, because that's a big fight. I think that is an important fight. I don't think that fight has to reflect the Republican vote. I think it has to reflect the heart of what the Democratic Party should be.
I also think that we need to remember there could be some exogenous variables coming in here. I mean, I think that if it is a great word. I think that if you see real fears about the budget deficit and the trade deficit, you're going to see a spike in interest rates. You could see really much higher interest rates, which will throw
everything
people
off. And
out
remember,
of work.
we have an election in 2 years.
Right.
Congress is elected in 2 years, and that's the next step. Instead of thinking 4 years from now, break it down so that it's achievable.
But let's see
And
how the
you're
people
right
in
with the
power
issues that come.
handle, if there is a
Exactly.
financial crisis, for example, who's the next chairman of the Federal Reserve going to be? Is it going to be an ideological person, or is it going to be someone who's got deep financial experience who people trust? How are they going to handle the budget deficit issues? Are they going to just keep cutting taxes and hope that it all sorts itself out, or is there going to be a real crisis? And I think how these people in power handle these questions is going to determine as much as the Democratic Party reconstituting itself.
Well, I think we're going to have to almost end with a series of questions. Go ahead. We've got 10 seconds, Roscoe. Whatever.
How long
Go
will
ahead.
it take for us to get out of Iraq?
Okay, and we end the discussion where we started with a question.
I feel less depressed after this discussion because I think we ended up on a more optimistic note.
Good, good. If the psychotherapy worked, I'm glad it did it there. Thank you all. It was my pleasure, certainly, to get into arguments with Ronnie, and I always discuss this with all of you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
History is our teacher.